it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. The angel of death is a concept found in various religious and mythological traditions. It is often depicted as a supernatural being responsible for carrying souls from the earthly realm to the afterlife, or the realm of the dead. In some traditions, the angel of death is portrayed as a benevolent guide who assists souls in their transition, while in others it's seen as a more ominous figure associated with fear and judgment. The exact characteristics and interpretations of the angel of death vary across different cultures and belief systems. We will see one such interpretation in tonight's story. Heroes, Angels, and Widowmakers. The Day Humanity Raced to Defeat Death. By Taxi Dancer. January 22nd, 1982. This was a tough one for Dr. Giovanni. It would have been easier if Jessica was elderly, having lived a good, long life, and now waiting to pass to the other side surrounded by loving family and lifelong friends. It would have been easier if Jessica were a young adult, having been in some sort of tragic accident which left her in a vegetative state, hooked up to machines which kept her artificially alive and prolonging her pain. But it wasn't. Jessica Angelini was a beautiful little 4-year-old girl, in every way vibrant and alive, and lying on her deathbed. "Don't cry, Mama," little Jessica seemed to say, looking at her mother with big, mournful hazel eyes. Though she couldn't speak because of the respirator tubes which ran up her nose and down her throat, little Jessica's tortured and crying eyes pleaded to her mama. "Please, don't be sad, Mama." This only made her mama cry even more as she held on to the cold and clammy hands of her little girl. She tried to be positive, to put on a brave face of hope for her beloved little girl. But after what Dr. Giovanni had told her, she wept openly. She prayed desperately for a miracle. Her father, Marco Angelini, was a simple construction worker whose modest salary allowed his family to live relatively comfortably paycheck to paycheck. He knelt at the foot of Jessica's hospital bed, hands clasped over his daughter's hand as he begged Dr. Giovanni for solutions which would save his baby girl. Alas, Dr. Giovanni had none. Sweet little Jessica contracted an ailment which affected only 1 in 114 million people worldwide, or about 70 people annually, and most of those infected were adults. For little Jessica Angelini, hers was only the 8th known case of this ailment striking someone below the age of 10. She was the youngest on record. Being on the island of Sardinia, the hospital there had no way to treat the sickness, and transport to better facilities on the mainland of Italy was no guarantee of a cure. Worse, this year most of Europe was under severe snows and blizzards, including the south of Italy, so transportation to the mainland was highly doubtful, if not extremely dangerous. Dr. Giovanni had to tell Jessica's parents this, along with the news that their daughter had only 24 hours left to live. The parents collapsed on their little girl upon hearing this, crying and gently hugging her, while little Jessica tried weakly to caress her parents' cheeks with soft, fragile hands that had IV tubes sticking out of them. The dying child turned to Dr. Giovanni and with silent, tearful, pleading eyes, begged him to do something to comfort her parents. Dr. Giovanni could only turn and silently leave the room so that her grieving parents could say goodbye however best they could. He stood outside the door of the room, the lump in his throat making it impossible to breathe. He'd seen the tragic passing of many of his patients which, for them, their time on this earth had come to a close. But this, well, this was different. There was a chance. A 1 in a billion chance that something could be done. The wind picked up outside and the windows of the hospital rattled, signaling the coming of a rare winter blizzard. So much has to be done in such a short time. So many people would have to be involved. So many miracles must occur if little Jessica were to see the light of tomorrow. The chances of that happening were nil at best. Better to leave them their private time alone until the end. Giovanni. The doctor heard his grandfather speaking to him, though he had passed many years ago. His grandfather served in the Italian army in World War II as a combat medic. Giovanni remembered how Grandpa was severely wounded in Russia, but refused treatment until he cared for the many wounded soldiers around him. He spent 7 years in a Russian POW camp before returning home. When we fought death itself. We never surrendered our fight with death until the spirit had left the body. Jessica, thought Giovanni. She has a lot of spirit. He'd read in a medical journal that German scientists and physicians may have found a cure. Taking a deep breath to collect himself, Dr. Giovanni marched into his office and placed a call to Germany. It was a long shot, 1,000,000 to 1 chance, but Giovanni wasn't ready to give up the fight yet. With that, the battle against death began. Hello, this is Dr. Felix Ulrich, Heidelberg University of Medicine. Yes, Dr. Giovanni. How are you? Oh, I see. Yes, you are correct. We are developing such a drug which has shown promising results. But I'm afraid that we have not advanced yet to the stage where we can test it on people. I see. Well, how old is your patient, Dr. Giovanni? My patient's name is Jessica Angelini, and she's 4 years and 2 months old, replied Giovanni. What? 4? Ah, I see. I'm afraid that the drug we're working on is formulated for much older patients. I'm sure that you're aware that this ailment attacks mostly older patients, yes? I'm aware of that, Dr. Ulrich, replied Giovanni, but it is the only hope that little girl has. If we do nothing, she will be gone within 24 hours. I understand, said Ulrich. There was a long silence, and Dr. Giovanni feared that the storm had cut their connection. I shall make some phone calls, Dr. Giovanni, said Dr. Ulrich. I cannot give you any guarantees, but I believe that, in this circumstance, we may be able to offer some assistance. Time will be of the essence. I shall call you back as soon as I can. Thank you, Dr. Ulrich. I'll let the Angelini family know. The angel of death couldn't help but feel a little bemused. Though he always won in the end, humankind always had that tendency to fight death kicking and screaming instead of simply fading peacefully into the eternal night. This was especially true when a child's life was involved. In fact, many who were not meant to pass over at that time had given their lives to save a child in danger. It was a noble thing which humankind possessed, and the angel of death admired that. Still, when a person's time had come, their time had come, and little Jessica Angelini's short time on this earth had expired. It was the angel of death's duty to come take her. There was no malice in his heart, nor was there any sadness or regret. It was just the task that had been given the angel of death until such time as the Creator said his duty was completed. Despite the snowstorm that was raging outside, Chief of Medical Sciences Dr. Sebastian Obermann could not miss the opera. He promised his wife to take her to see Mozart's The Magic Flute for weeks at the Theatre and Opera House of Heidelberg. Tickets were hard to come by. However, halfway through the first act, an usher came to his balcony seat with an urgent phone call from Dr. Ulrich. "This is Obermann," he said in an annoyed voice, angry at having been called away from the show on this, his only night off. "What is it, Ulrich?" "Yes, a patient for the new drug." "Where?" "Sardinia." "Jessica Angelini is how old?" "Oh, Dr. Ulrich, you know that drug isn't formulated for children." Dr. Ulrich pleaded his case, reminding Dr. Obermann that this was a rare opportunity to test the new drugs, seeing as those afflicted by the ailment were few and very far between. And the fact that this was a little girl who would die within a day and whose parents had nothing to lose in finding a cure made this situation one of particular urgency. Okay, fine," said Obermann. Let's say I approve the release of the drug for testing purposes. How do you intend to get the drug all the way to Sardinia in the middle of a blizzard? I believe I have a solution, Dr. Obermann. Again, it's a long shot, but I cannot continue if you're not willing to release the drug. Yes, of course I shall release the drug, answered Dr. Obermann. I will have to travel to the manufacturer's premises since I am the only authorized signatory to release it. But I will release it tonight. I understand, said Ulrich, with much relief in his voice. Shall I arrange transportation for you from the opera house to the company? No, I'll take care of that, Dr. Ulrich. You take care of how he's getting to Sardinia. Yes, Doctor, and thank you. Dr. Ulrich hung up the phone before quickly picking it up again. Hello, operator. I need the number for the Memmingen Air Base central operator. I need to be patched through to the 34th Fighter Bomber Wing. I'm sorry, Dr. Ulrich, said Lieutenant Colonel Kiefer Adelberg, the executive officer of the Luftwaffe 34th Fighter Bomber Wing. Tell me again what you're asking. Yes, Colonel Adelberg, of course. There is a medical emergency in Sardinia. A 4-year-old little girl named Jessica will die tomorrow unless we can get our new drug to her. No conventional aircraft will be able to get to her fast enough. So you are requesting that one of our starfighters fly it down to her, said Colonel Adelberg. Yes, Colonel, said Ulrich. There's no other fighter that is faster than the starfighter that is capable to deliver the drug in time. And there is no aircraft as dangerous to fly in weather conditions such as this as the starfighter, said Adelberg regretfully. I'm sure you know that the Luftwaffe's relationship with the starfighter is a challenging one at best. It is an unforgiving aircraft to fly, and already we have lost over 100 pilots in crashes involving the starfighter. That is why we call it the Widowmaker. To attempt to fly it in these weather conditions would be extremely unwise. Dr. Ulrich's heart sank. I see. So your starfighters cannot help us save that little girl's life, then? I said it would be unwise to attempt to fly it, said Adelberg. I didn't say we wouldn't try to help. I need to call the commanding officer, Colonel Danner. We'll need to ready one of our starfighters for the flight and obtain flight clearance with the Austrian and Italian air forces to overfly their territory. Moreover, we'll need to find a Luftwaffe pilot who is suicidal enough to take on this mission. It will take time, Doctor. Meanwhile, Dr. Obermann was making his apologies to his wife, quickly explaining the urgency of why he had to leave and making arrangements for a taxi to come pick her up and take her home after the opera. He made one more phone call to the chief of police, and within minutes, a city snowplow and a police cruiser were waiting outside of the opera house to take Dr. Obermann to the manufacturers where the new drug was kept. What would have been a long and laborious drive through the snow-swept streets went by relatively quickly thanks to the snowplow clearing the way ahead and the Heidelberg Police Department stopping traffic at the traffic lights to allow them to pass. Within the hour, Dr. Obermann was at the facility and had completed the laborious chain of custody papers and reason for request documentation. As he was leaving, Dr. Obermann was surprised to find 2 large Bundeswehr Mankat 1 transport trucks waiting for him on the nearby German Army logistics base, their massive tires and powerful engines more than capable of traversing the blizzard conditions. This would be sorely needed for the next leg of the trip, as the Memmingen Luftwaffe Air Base, where the starfighter was being prepared at this very moment, was a perilous 120-kilometer road march through extreme weather conditions which was impassable to most other vehicles. The soldiers instructed Dr. Obermann to enter the second truck, the first truck being used as the pathmaker for the 2-truck convoy. The snowplow and the police escorted the military trucks to the city limits. It was nearly 11 o'clock in the evening, and the streets were relatively clear. However, the winds were picking up and visibility was dropping to only a few dozen meters in front of the vehicles. The police escort wished Dr. Obermann and his military escort good luck once they reached the Autobahn, and despite the Autobahn being lined with powerful bright streetlights, The roadway ahead was only dimly lit owing to the raging snowstorm. The two trucks slowly emerged onto the Autobahn, where 120 kilometers of icy road awaited them. The angel of death took a brief moment from his labors to briefly admire the tremendous effort that was being put forward by mankind to save the life of a child, though he felt no regret that, ultimately, all of those efforts will not come to fruition. Already the angel of death had collected the spirits of 117 souls who had fallen victim to the blizzard and had guided them to their eternal resting place. When a person's time comes, only one thing can stop a visit from the angel of death. And in a few hours, he'd be in Sardinia to take little Jessica Angelini. Still, there was a very slim, an impossibly slim chance that humanity might avert Jessica's passing. The angel of death would have to take some measures to not allow that to happen. Measures which would most certainly take the lives of those rushing to give the little girl a chance at life. Again, the angel of death felt no regret at this, nor any feeling of malice. Simply her time to go. The soldiers driving the trucks had to carefully balance safety and speed. Go too slow and the weather would close in so much at the airbase that it would be nearly impossible to get the Starfighter, an aircraft that was challenging to fly in the best of conditions, up into the blizzard-ravaged skies. Go too quickly, and the ice-coated roads could easily bring the convoy to a disastrous end. Because the road signs were nearly invisible in the white haze, the soldiers in the lead truck relied on their map and the truck's odometer to determine the 100-kilometer point, where they were to take the exit off the Autobahn and continue the final leg of the journey to the airbase. At the 100-kilometer mark, and even though they'd slowed their speed, the exit ramp remained unseen until they'd nearly passed it. The young German soldier in the front overcompensated to try and get onto the exit ramp. The big truck's tires lost traction on the ice-covered road and missed the exit, instead departing the road and barreling down the embankment next to the exit ramp, before coming to an abrupt but somewhat cushioned halt in a snowbank which virtually buried the passenger cab of the truck. The driver of the follow-on truck, in which Dr. Obermann and his valuable cargo was riding, slowed even more and inched its way down the exit ramp until they came to where the first truck rested. Much to everyone's relief, the two soldiers in the truck were already standing outside, the sergeant truck commander already on the radio calling for assistance. "We're fine," yelled the sergeant to the driver of the second truck. "The truck is only slightly damaged, just stuck in the snow. Memmingen is sending a wrecker to pull us out. We'll be okay. Just go and get the doctor to the airbase." Now alone, the truck traveled down the much narrower and darkened streets, the only illumination coming from the headlights as visibility seemed to be cut even more as the wind and snow battered the truck, the driver struggling to keep it on the road. After what seemed like days, they finally saw the lights of the expansive airbase and the welcoming security checkpoint where Air Force military police were waiting to escort them into the Flight Operations Center. Also at the gate, a wrecker was waiting to leave the base to go rescue the truck which had crashed. As they made their way towards the operations center, following the flashing blue lights of the Air Force MP vehicle, the soldiers finally addressed the issue which no one wanted to discuss. They looked over at the runway and couldn't see it. Neither could they see the runway marking lights. The entirety of the German military was painfully aware of the reputation of the Widowmaker, so much so that the gallows humor of the German Air Force had a popular joke that, if one wanted an F-104 starfighter of their very own, all anyone had to do was to buy a plot of farmland, then wait. By 1982, over 200 of West Germany's 900 starfighters had been lost to accidents and crashes. "You think they can get a starfighter up in this weather, Sergeant?" asked the driver. The sergeant sighed in doubt. "This was an audacious plan from the beginning. This is an audacious mission that we've undertaken. I heard that the squadron commander said that the pilots wanting to volunteer for this mission must not be married. If disaster strikes, at least the Widowmaker will not be making another widow tonight." Lieutenant Colonel Adelberg and the base commander, Colonel Danner, were waiting for Dr. Obermann when he arrived. After the quick greetings, Dr. Obermann was introduced to a Bundeswehr pilot in his early 30s by the name of Captain Dietrich Bauer. He stood about 5 foot 9 inches, actually shorter than the average German male, who stood closer to 6 feet, and was rather lanky, his flight suit looking to be a bit too large for his frame. His somewhat longish, dirty blonde hair topped a mature-looking, chiseled face with confident blue eyes which, either audaciously or foolishly, seemed to hold no fear of death. When Dr. Obermann questioned whether the mission could be accomplished, Captain Bauer confidently exclaimed that both he and his aircraft would accomplish the mission despite the dark reputation that the starfighter earned. The F-104 starfighter had been described quite literally as a missile with a man in it, and in many ways that's exactly what it was. It looked like a needle with a single powerful engine. Unlike the contemporary fighters of the time with wide, long, tapering wings that produced optimal lift and maneuverability, the starfighter had very short, stubby wings with a high T-tail in the rear, which reduced drag, but, unfortunately, also reduced maneuverability. It was designed to fly high and fast in a straight line, and although it was designated as a fighter, it hardly had any of the maneuverability that would give it a good counting in such a dogfight. But as a quick slash and attack fighter, the starfighter could not be beaten, just as long as it kept its speed up and did not get dragged into a maneuvering dogfight. To be honest, Captain Bauer believed that the starfighter was the most magnificently beautiful fighter in the world, but piloting it was just like dating a supermodel, being temperamental, high maintenance, and needing lots of attention. The starfighter that Bauer would be piloting on this mission would be a 2-seater version, painted in 3 shades of dark and light olive green, a bright white nose cone. Mounted on the wingtips of the almost razor-sharp wings were 2 unusually long fuel drop tanks for the trip. Calculations had to be carefully made of the dose for little Jessica, accounting for her gender, age, and weight. Because of the advanced condition of her sickness, we decided to give her a full adult dose, split into 2 1/2 doses. The heavily reinforced white plastic case which held the experimental drug was carefully and securely strapped into the rear seat of the fighter. As this was happening, the ground crew were busy securing the heating generators, which was keeping the control surfaces clear of snow and ice. Captain Bauer climbed up the metal stairs to the cockpit, having to hold on tightly or risk being blown off the ice-covered rungs. However, as he was being strapped into his cockpit, he was confident that his aircraft was flight-ready. Unfortunately, the runway was not, and because of the low air density caused by the blizzard, he would need every inch of the runway to take off. In order to make it possible to use the runway for takeoff, the Luftwaffe would need to rely on their allies in the US Air Force to prep the runway. The Americans had a detachment of their mighty C-141 Starlifter transports located on the base. After some discussion between Colonel Danner and the American detachment commander, the Americans had one of their giant 170-foot-long and 60-foot-wide transports on the runway, its 4 engines blazing. The plan was to have the Starlifter roll down the snowy runway and use its 4 Pratt & Whitney turbofan engines to blow the snow and ice off the runway. Then, at the end of the runway, turn the giant aircraft around and repeat the process on the way back. Once the transport turned off into the taxiway, Captain Bauer would rocket his fighter at full throttle down the temporarily cleared runway and hopefully be able to get airborne. This itself would be a dangerous maneuver because even though the transport would not be taking off, the Americans still ran the risk of sliding off the runway if they weren't careful, and a blocked runway would literally be death to the little baby girl they were all trying to save. The timing had to be perfect. After the American transport began taxiing down the runway, the powerful engines blowing a narrow path through the ice and snow, Captain Bauer taxied his fighter into position to take off. Understanding that the Americans were being cautious as they made their first run down the runway, before turning the giant plane around to come back lest they slip off the runway, Captain Bauer was getting anxious. This was taking far too long. The snow was already reclaiming the runway as Bauer awaited the command from the tower to launch. He throttled up the engine as the Americans completed their circuit of the runway and pulled their giant star lifter onto the taxiway. The lights on the runway were barely visible, and Captain Bauer could barely see a few dozen meters in front of his cockpit. The runway was in condition to where he had a 50-50 chance of getting off the ground, if he were lucky. And as the wind and snow pummeled his fighter, Bauer knew that he had to go before the runway became unusable again. Where was the damn call from the tower? Nightingale 1. Nightingale 1, this is the tower. Abort mission, I repeat, abort mission. Roger, tower, replied Captain Bauer, pushing full throttle and gunning the powerful engine of the starfighter. Launching now. He didn't hear the base commander yelling over the radio to abort mission. At the end of the runway, it had covered with ice again. Visibility was pitch black save for the millions of white snowflakes shooting past his canopy. He fought to keep his fighter centered on the path which the Americans had made, the whole time the wind buffeting his aircraft, about to flip it over. The Angel of Death took a moment to look down and observe what was happening, not out of admiration or intent to do harm, but because he had a feeling that he'd soon be needed to guide another soul into the afterlife. He stood by watching without emotion as he awaited the inevitable crash to happen. Starfighter wasn't designed to take off in these conditions, but at the high speed he was going, Captain Bauer was committed now. Hours seemed to compress into a few fleeting seconds. Bauer had taken off from this runway enough times to know when to pull back on the stick and retract the wheels without actually seeing outside. He pulled back on the stick, and the fighter jumped into the sky. The satisfying thump-clump of the landing gear successfully retracting into the fighter. He was off the ground. Allowing himself a half-second of relief, Bauer knew that even though he'd gotten his aircraft airborne, he was still in terrible danger. The starfighter wouldn't survive so much buffeting, and he knew that he had to get his fighter above the blizzard as quickly as possible. 15 minutes. Just hold together for 15 minutes until we can get above the... The buffeting was getting stronger as the pilot struggled just to keep the fighter wings leveled. Had he been not so securely strapped in place, he would have been tossed about inside the cockpit. He was flying on instruments alone, trusting in the spinning horizon indicator and altimeter to confirm that he was headed in a generally straight-up direction. At this point, he was happy with just straight up, but not only was he losing speed, he was also losing flight control. He could feel his fighter going into an unrecoverable and fatal flat spin. It was too heavy. Too heavy. Clutching the stick to his chest, he pulled straight up, ejecting his external wingtip fuel pods. At this point, the starfighter literally became a missile with a man in it. Bauer simply hoping to keep the fighter in a nose-up position and letting the kinetic energy take him above the storm. Just hold together for a few more minutes. Just a few more. The starfighter shot almost straight up through the black, swirling tempest of clouds. All of a sudden, the whirling blackness of clouds and snow was replaced by a clear, calm, night sky filled with stars. A bright full moon hung in space, illuminating the maelstrom below the starfighter in a surreal, almost mystical whirlpool of deep purple and violet hues. Breathing heavily with relief, Captain Bauer opened the secure channel back to Menningen. He'd already decided to launch, whether or not he would be given clearance. Though relieved that he'd just pulled off the impossible, the pilot's relief was tempered by the fact that he'd just disobeyed a direct order from his commanding officer. Nightingale 1 to base. Nightingale 1 to base. I'm at Angels 36 level, heading 350 degrees and turning due south for Sardinia. He held his breath, waiting for the stinging reprimand from Colonel Dano, which would effectively end his career in the Luftwaffe if he survived this mission. It seemed like an eternity had passed before Colonel Dano came over the radio. Roger, Nightingale. Understand that you are above the storm and are en route as scheduled. Godspeed, Nightingale. Captain Bauer breathed a deep sigh of relief, feeling lucky that he dodged another bullet as he turned his fighter south in the direction of Sardinia. He checked his watch. 20 hours had already passed. He only had 4 hours left. The easy part was over, and the hard part was about to begin. "Hold on, little one," whispered the pilot as he kicked in the afterburners. Thunder and quake shook the air as the starfighter went supersonic, ripping apart the sound barrier. "Hold on, little one. Help is coming." The angel of death observed all of this, curious but not questioning why the Creator allowed the fortunate pilot to live this far. No matter. His task was to take the life of Jessica Angelini in a few hours. It would be a race then. Despite being a neutral spirit, neither good or bad, benevolent or malicious, the angel of death felt a small spark of excitement. He would reach Jessica first, the angel or the widowmaker. Dr. Giovanni quickly picked up the phone when the commander of the Decimomannu Air Base, the joint Italian-German air base located in Sardinia, called. Yes, Colonel Lombardo. This is Dr. Giovanni. Yes, good. The drug is on the way? Good. Please, sir, make all haste. Little Jessica Angelini is slipping from us. Her vital signs are getting weaker. Yes, sir. Thank you. Please, hurry. You have my word, Dr. Giovanni, said Colonel Lombardo. Please tell the parents of that little girl that we're doing our very best. Have faith, we will get the medication there. Colonel Lombardi hung up the phone, taking stock of the new developments which might make his promise impossible to keep. The blizzard had subsided to freezing rain, but not before overtaxing the main power grid, which blacked out a fourth of the power on the island. The base was on emergency generator power, but it wasn't enough to power the runway lights. Worse, ice sheets had formed on the runway, and with the starfighters higher than normal landing speeds, an attempt to land under such conditions was only one step away from suicide. Under normal circumstances, the fighter would have been waved away to another suitable landing zone. But in this case, that was not an option. If the little girl was to have even a chance to live, that German pilot needed to put his aircraft down here. It was Colonel Lombardi's duty to make that happen. It was just before dawn, too dark for the pilot to land visually, not under these weather conditions. Colonel Lombardi ordered every vehicle on the base, both military and civilian, to line up along the runway with headlights on bright in order to illuminate the runway. And to assist the 2 shovel trucks in clearing the runway, Colonel Lombardi ordered an all-hands-on deck, all available personnel on base, to report to the runway with shovels. Because they didn't have the luxury of an American C-141 to clear the runway, the stalwart German and Italian airmen would have to try and do it by hand. Because of the blistering speed of the Widowmaker, Captain Bauer crossed into Sardinian airspace in less than an hour and a half, where a traditional airliner would have taken 4 hours to make the flight. The tower at Decimomannu Air Base informed him of the situation on the ground, the loss of power, the makeshift efforts to illuminate the runway, and finally the icy runway conditions which they were trying to clear. All of these were justifiable conditions for a pilot to turn back. Decimomannu Air Base Tower told Captain Bauer that that was an option, as landing under these conditions in the Widowmaker was far, far from ideal. "I'm not married, Decimomannu Tower," laughed Bauer nervously. Checking his watch, he said, "We have a little over 2 hours to save a life. I'll see you on the ground." As the starfighter descended into the cloud cover, the buffeting began again, though it was not as extreme as it was back in Germany. Emerging below the thick grey cloud bank, Bauer guided his fighter towards the airbase, straining his eyes to pick up the runway being illuminated by vehicle lights. Fortunately, the power was out, and after a while of desperate searching, Bauer could make out the dimly lit runway against an otherwise black background. Again, he would have to trust his instruments when landing. Even under these precarious conditions, Bauer was confident that he could bring his fighter down. The icy conditions he had no control over. The runway cleared as Bauer lowered the landing gear, and although the sun's rays were peeking slowly over the overcast horizon, visibility was still very poor. With the landing gear locked in place, Bauer held the stick tightly as his starfighter, the world-famous Widowmaker, made its final approach to the runway. The starfighter touched down with a bump which sent the aircraft airborne again. The tailwind was making the starfighter much faster and more difficult to control. It became painfully obvious to Bauer that he'd need more landing distance than the runway could provide. The front landing gear snapped and broke off as the starfighter hit the runway again. The entire front part of the fighter slammed into the ice as Bauer opened the speed brakes, dropped flaps, stepped on the brakes, and everything else he could think of to stop the runaway fighter as it careened down the runway, spinning several times as it approached the end of it. Dr. Giovanni swiftly snatched up the phone when Colonel Lombardi called. "Dr. Giovanni," the colonel said, "I'm afraid that the fighter carrying the medication crashed upon landing. But..." "Dr. Giovanni," a nurse burst into his office. "Jessica has stopped breathing." Dr. Giovanni immediately hung up the phone, rushing to Jessica's room. "Call her cold blue, nurse. Hang on, little spirit, hang on." An hour later, Dr. Giovanni, Captain Bauer, and Colonel Lombardi stood silently outside little Jessica's room, looking in. Captain Bauer had a heavy bandage wrapped around his head, his right arm in a sling. Little Jessica's parents sat next to their daughter, each holding one of her fragile little hands. Both her parents had their heads buried in the little girl's chest, crying profusely. "We should go now," said Dr. Giovanni. "Let's leave them a little privacy." As Dr. Giovanni closed the door, Captain Bauer's gaze lingered on the beautiful little brown-eyed girl laying on the bed hooked up to so many tubes and monitors. Little Jessica looked upon the injured pilot with smiling, grateful eyes. Though she still could not speak, she smiled as brightly as she could, Jessica's heart singing with joy that her parents were happy once more. The angel of death left that place, rising into the sky to continue his duties. He was neither angry nor upset that he'd lost the race. If the Creator chose to spare someone, the angel of death could not and would not disagree. This was, after all, just a job. Well, everybody, I hope you enjoyed that one. A fantastic story, as always, from Taxi Dancer. Now, I know his stories sometimes cause a bit of controversy, a bit of argument amongst you, but I don't think anyone can argue about the excellence of that one. Definitely not me. Really enjoyed that. Okay, so that is your Monday evening's entertainment. I will be back again, as always, very, very soon. So hope you're going to join me again on Wednesday. Yeah, why not? Wednesday night. Okay? Till then, my dear friends, very, very sweet dreams. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.